What is the government strategy in terms of exports, in terms of export revival during COVID-19? You're on mute.
Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So thank you for that question. Thank you also, Dr. Saab, for inviting me. This is a very interesting panel so far. Uh, Perhaps I'll explain the background. Usually, and I think Shafiq Saab will talk about that particular portion. The government's trade promotion, primary trade promotion document is something called the STPF, the Strategic Trade Framework or Strategy. And should have been 2018, 2023, the Strategic Trade Promotion Network framework. But we've not been able, for some reason, to finalize that. However, since I'm no longer the Parliamentary Secretary of Commerce, as of almost a year now, at this point, I'd resigned. So I'm not current with the document that is being prepared now. However, if you were to look a little bit at the budget figures, you'll see that the entire budget, one of the reasons, major reasons we've put ourselves in a bind, the federal government, by imposing no new taxes is to ensure that this is a pro-business budget. So we're trying to stimulate spending on economic activity. Pre-budget, if you'll recall, there was a 1.24 trillion stimulus package that was announced by this government. One third of it, a very small portion, in fact, less than 200 billion was directed towards COVID in itself, with the medical part of it, procurements and NDMA. 480 billion was targeted toward businesses, and out of that, a large chunk went to exporters so they can have liquidity back, and that's a huge issue. And it's a traditional issue always for our exporters. The other thing which we did was we gave a historic 50 billion package to, we don't call them MSMEs yet in Pakistan, we call them SMEs. There's another 50 billion package for agriculture, which is more or less non-existent. If you look at the budget of Sindh, government of Sindh, you're probably more aware than I am that agriculture and food are a provincial subject now. Yet the federal government has given 50 billion for promotion of agriculture products in Pakistan, responsible for food security, but looking at the export angle as well. Given that this is a COVID year and we have certain concerns due to artificial shortages in wheat, so being cautious on food exports, but that is somewhere we can have an exportable surplus. Let me just also clarify a little bit the ambit of legislation where exports are concerned. If you're the Minister for Trade and Commerce, that's a different thing. But if you're a regular parliamentarian, then you your eye on a number of things. You're looking at the for instance, we got 2 delegations on cost of doing business and ease of doing business. Mango exporters, PIA had raised rates, historic 500 or 550 rupees per kg for mangoes, for exports to the Gulf, and then to Canada and United States, 700 rupees per kg. Now, that is not, nobody's going to buy your mango at that rate. So when we spoke to the PIA and the minister, they said, well, since we're trying to compete with Emirates and Qatar, we decided to rack our rates. Now, that just shows you a basic lack of understanding. You do not raise competitiveness by raising your prices, you lower your prices. So that was taken care of, and PIA was incredibly helpful. They've slashed their rates to pre-budget, even less than pre-budget. We call them COVID rates. And the other thing, that the Afghan border was sealed for trade. They were only trading 6 hours a day, 3 days a week. We opened up the border through NCOC yesterday for 7 days a week, 24 days. Now, that's the second part of what we legislators are doing to ensure that the roadblocks, the SPS, the Ts, the cost of doing business, ease of doing business, that is looked at in an emergency, the specific committee on agriculture products. The third thing we're doing is looking at long-term legislation. For this budget, it was pre-budget, and I was lucky enough to work with, while I was a consultant at Commerce Ministry, Shafiq Saab was there. I drafted our first GI law back in 2006 with billions of amendments. Now, finally, it is the law, and this is the final point, the e-commerce policy. I worked on that since 2015, and it's finally become something tangible. So I guess what I'm saying is the interest right now of the government of Pakistan is not necessarily so much on international exports, but the uncertainty due to the pandemic. You're facing the $9 trillion crunch. Now, trying to find a new market and a good product is not the easiest in normal times. So let alone in COVID times. So we're looking at making sure that we can stimulate the domestic commerce part of it, create a supply side capacity, because you know that for our agriculture, we face SPS and TBT problems, qualitative and standard issues. And on the exports side, we just have a six-product basket is stifling this country. And we haven't moved beyond that in the last 40 years. So to create a market for niche products, as I said, difficult enough in normal times. To do that in COVID times is twice as hard. But as I said, we have an SME stimulation package. We're going to see how we can do more on services, because historically that's been our strength. But I leave it at that now.
Do you think suppressing imports is enough as a strategy to keep the current account deficit in check?
Thank you, Reba. We've heard some really good things so far. It's funny, when we talk about trade, budgets, commerce and trade, the impression that usually goes out to non-specialists that there are these fine lines dividing the whole, but it isn't. Unfortunately, in this country, and I don't blame any political party, though I come from one, I've had the good luck or the bad luck to have worked with nearly 4 or 5 commerce ministers in an advisory capacity. The problem is the whole of the government approach is missing. And this is again coming from, because I bring to this particular discussion a political dimension, so I think it's important to mention that. For instance, the 18th Amendment. It's a very well thought out amendment in terms of what it does for democracy. What it didn't address was how you were going to do it. So you sent industry, labor, women, food, agriculture, all of that to the province. You kept commerce, exports, food security, and SMEs at the center. What you didn't do, and of course BOI, you have 1 federal BOI and 4 provincial BOI. You never figured out, by you I mean country, the people who were doing this work, a methodology whereby you can actually sit and talk to the provinces, because it's not Islamabad that produces anything, right? So this is by way of background, that the reason you see all these failures, in particular in the last 5 years, is not because it was known league. Your 18th Amendment didn't give directives on how to do what they wanted. It's very important that the provinces look after industry, they raise the bar, they bring up productivity, they create niche products. But no, now of course one can say that the provincial government are not children, we're not supposed to coddle them. But anytime there's such a huge devolution, you need to look after the process. And unfortunately, that wasn't looked after. Fair enough, it happened now. Since your question is very specific, I'm going to respond to that. And if you'll allow me, I'm going to read from my own notes, because I need to be sure I give you the right numbers. So if you'll recall, we've had a historic current account deficit as well as a trade deficit. And what it does to the economy, for those of us who are not that well versed, at least I wasn't, I was a trade person, I've fast had to become a finance person, is that it brings you at the risk of default. When you can't pay back your loans, what happens is you become like, God forbid, Venezuela. It takes you to Iran, thank God, because it has oil. Well, not in the current scenario, but before the pandemic, oil was giving a lot of stability, and because of the foreign exchange reserves to Iran, even though the growth was already in minus 3%. So you have these different dimensions that we don't have. But if I could just go to the CAD issue, the suppression of imports, a very flawed strategy if I were to talk as an economist. But since I'm not, I'm lucky enough I can make a political statement. It's the only tool we had at the time that we could bring down your burning house. We had to control your default. And the only way to do that was to bring down your imports. Now, when you do that, you're also bringing down the imports you need. You're bringing down machinery, you're bringing down raw materials, semi-finished goods, because as I said, there's no fine line in economics. It's not like a science. So there was a price to be paid. There would have been repercussions, but we needed to bring down our house in order. So we brought it down from 6% of GDP, the CAD, to right now under 2.5% in 2020. Now, it's not enough. We also need to increase our exports. But as I told you in my earlier question, and this is where this sort of dovetails, that to increase your exports in regular times is difficult when you're not as competitive as your Vietnam, as your Chinese, as your Thailand, as your Philippines. So you have a competitiveness problem. And then, as many of our colleagues already mentioned, if you look at the World Bank indicators on world governance indicators, that's one of the biggest barriers to FDI in Pakistan. So how will you increase your exports if you don't have local financing? And that, again, is another problem. You have one of the best investment policies in the world. Brazil, by the way, doesn't have any BITs, and they get far more investment than we do with all the BITs we have. Starting in 1960 something, with the first one was with Germany. Now, by the way, Indonesia and South Africa in the process of scrapping their BITs as well, but that's a different story. So, to increase your exports, the government is also, again, this has been mentioned, we're trying to reduce entire tariff line duty. So on raw materials, of course, some people in the country are upset that you are now dispersing your local raw material industry. But again, these are COVID times. You need tough times call for tough measures. May not be the most perfect solution, but it is for the moment something done for the first time to absolutely remove the duties on import of raw materials. The idea has been that what is not available locally, we import that. However, private sector, the main issue in CAT, one is suppression of imports, the other is increase of exports. But until and unless the private sector steps up, look, we talk about the GSP plus. GSP plus is for 10 years. That's longer than short term. That's not long term in terms of 20 or 30 years, but it's longer than short term, it's longer than medium term. 2 terms of government. That should have prompted the private sector to do certain things, which they didn't do. And that's where my disappointment lies. If you recall, um, JCPenney, Walmart, Disney, and a couple of others pulled out of Pakistan because of poor governance by the private sector. So I think the private sector in Pakistan still doesn't understand that while it is the government's job to bring you preferences, to bring you lower tariffs in international export markets, to help you with your marketing, the government has no business being in business. We cannot be. You look at PIA, you look at the steel mills, you look at the PMT. If there's a prime examples of how governments have failed, state-owned enterprises will fail eventually. Unless you're like Germany, you will fail. So I think the lesson here is that in Pakistan, nobody talks about the private sector failures. The focus is so much on the government mismanagement that we forget that this is the same nation of people. You don't import your government officials from anywhere. They're the same Pakistanis who work in the private sector, who work in the military, who work in the media, who work in the private sector. You need to overhaul this entire mindset of the business sector as well.
What efforts should be undertaken to enhance understanding of parliamentarian key
Thank you, Reba. As I understood, we had 2 questions, no, on parliamentarians' capacity and capability. Am I correct?
Ms. Shandana?
Yes, yes. If you will recall, Ariba, just for my understanding, there were 2 questions on parliamentarians. One was on what efforts should be undertaken to enhance understanding of parliamentarians, and also why can't we have a meaningful debate in the parliament on budget or trade policy of Pakistan? Am I
Precisely.
correct? So
Correct.
if it's all right with you, I'd like to take them both together because they highlight different dimensions of the political paradigms we
Sure.
seem to face. Is that okay?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So, firstly, as I said, I'm a new convert to politics. I'm a parliamentarian. Yes, I don't know yet if I'm a politician. I'm definitely a technocrat. We'll see how that goes. We've still got 3 more years in our basket. Coming from a trade background, the reason I joined this party was because the current prime minister, was looking for technocrats, in particular women, and in particular from KP and Balochistan. So let's just say that at least I saw intent in this particular prime minister to ensure that we have right people, right kind of people on board, to ensure that that your parliament, uh, people who enter parliament can actually talk about the things that they're supposed to. Now, there's a difference between elected MNAs and reserve MNAs, whether you're minorities or whether you're women. The reason they bring in minorities and women like me is because people tend not to vote for technocrats. People prefer to vote for those people who visit the constituency, i.e., non technocrats. Now, that is where the base problem comes in. You have populist governments, popular candidates versus technocrats. And that's been a plague for India, Pakistan, all governments in the developing world. So part of the problem lies in the structure that we have. Democracy is not supposed to elect technical people. Democrats are supposed to elect popular people. We'll go for funerals, we'll go to the weddings, we'll speak for the people. And that is why you don't have necessarily balanced discussions in parliament, because people are keen to ensure that their constituents hear them speak about things that the constituents care about. Constituents don't care about microeconomic policy. What constituents want is water, electricity, jobs, gas, power, schools, hospitals. So, which is why your budget debates will always be of a low quality, with a few given exceptions, unless you talk about agriculture or you talk about jobs, because people don't understand. And it's only fair. You've got a country where your literacy rate is pretty low. And then you've got a country where your employment rates, even before COVID, were not the best. For the last 40 years, we've not had a strong industrial policy. In fact, zero industrial policy at the federal level for the last 13 years, 14 years. So you've created a country, pardon my French, you've deliberately dumbed it down. There's a book called Dumbing America Down, but we've done this to our country. We want our constituents to not be smart so they don't question us on the difficult things. And that is the unfortunate political dimension of it. Now, whether our party can bring that difference remains to be seen. At the end of 5 years, you will see if we've made a qualitative difference. Quantitatively, we're always going to remain the same. But to change the quality, you also need to change the mindset of your populace. And that's the hardest thing I have to do. I mean, since your question was very specific about parliamentarians' performance during the budget and the quality of the debate, but the problem is much wider than that. And I've experienced, as I said, I'm not an elected member, I'm a reserve member, so I don't have to ask anyone for a vote, and I don't have to pander to anybody's baser discussions. But I can tell you that the pandemic was a test for me as well, because during the lockdown, my constituents couldn't care less about the pandemic. They were reduced because they come from two different backgrounds. They come either from agriculture or the construction industry. And they said this lockdown is for the rich people of Pakistan who can afford 6 months groceries and basic medical supplies. We can't do that. You've reduced us to beggars. And so that is the problem. What they don't understand is we are trying to save the economy, save them, and save ourselves from the pandemic, where their interests are very singular. So parliamentarians, unfortunately, work on those singular interests. And that is how they win elections. So there has, and which is why you see a huge team of technocrats in the Prime Minister's team working with him, is because while you will have populist leaders in the parliament, you need those technical people to ensure that both the long-term, medium, and short-term problems are resolved. I hope that answers your question.
A question for you, and that is actually building on the same question that Ariba asked you about having debate in the parliament about budget and trade issues. So there is general discussion in Pakistan. Why don't we have a political consensus on some key economic issues? And I personally think that this trade competitiveness is a matter of survival for the country in many ways. So is there a possibility that we can have a political consensus on trade-related laws, measures, and policies? So how do you see it, particularly when every political party also come from a different ideological, lineage and additional, ideological, stances as well on trade and economy?
Thank you, Naveed sir. Couple of points of view here, because that's not one question, there's a few questions. For starters, I can also actually see the question in our sidebar. There's a question on the Charter of Democracy between parties. I don't know if you had a look at that. And it's a very interesting question in that I think there's a gentleman who has, Muhammad Usman Khalid, he's mentioned the same thing. He's talked about a Charter of Democracy. If we could have that, why can't we have a Charter of Economy for framing a policy for the next 40 years? He's also talked about the potential of youth in agriculture. So I think I'll take all of these together and perhaps explain the political background as I understand it. First problem is that we're in a particular time frame right now. This is not the pandemic. If you recall, the predecessor to the current National Accountability Bureau was the Ehtisab Bureau. Ehtisab Bureau was framed when there was a military dictatorship, an ex-military officer who then became the head of the state. And as you well know, then the 18th Amendment came in. There can be no longer any usurpation of powers of the civilian elected government, no matter how corrupt or bad your rulers are. It's a choice between one or the other. But if the people have a will, that must be respected. Elected people must be allowed to complete their mandate, elected governments. Now, that is your basic thinking. Unfortunately, the NAB law was used in the last 10 years for political victimization often based on reality, but used in such a way. So I really can't get up and say, you, Gonzalo, you're going to have an app case against you, simply because Gonzalo doesn't work for the government and he has, as far as we know, nothing to answer for. But Shafiq Saab, that's a different story altogether. He's disappeared from here. And so NAB was used to grab onto people who had dubious transactions, but it wasn't done because it was done to favor the country. It was done to settle scores. So that was a pity. Unfortunately, that's been done for scores of years for the Criminal Procedure Code, the Civil Procedure Code, the Pakistan Penal Code. So NAB operated on the same methodology. Now, when you've actually got a government that is neither one or the other, who was doing it against each other, you've got currently a government which is investigating its own people. If I could just bring in politics for a second, you've got the sugar, IPP, wheat, in addition to the petroleum mafia. I think they try to take stay in the High Court yesterday against a commission which is investigating the OMCs. I use these strong words for a reason. And the reason is that, unfortunately, every political party has friends within friends, and they all have access to the highest policy makers. These cartels and mafias have not popped up in the last 6 months or a year. They've been there for a very long time. They've been allowed to fester. So when you have a setup like that, it's very difficult to do a charter of economy, because when you talk about something which we've done in this budget already, we have rationalized our subsidies. Ideally, in a poor developing country, you shouldn't have subsidies for the richest. You should have subsidies for the poorest. And yet we continue to subsidy the richest in this country on one pretext or the other. But because they're so strongly entrenched in the system of production, let's put it that way. I don't want to take the name of one particular organization where all the policies come from the STPF, that it is difficult. They have over the years positioned themselves so strongly in the system that if you don't subsidize them, your entire value chain of the economy will fall down and people will lose jobs. So we're slowly, this is the first time we've done this. We've rationalized the subsidies. We will do it further in the next couple of years, in particular for those industries that don't need those subsidies. I know one particular industry that takes 4 different subsidies at 4 different stages of production. They have a freight subsidy, they have a minimum income support price, they have a distribution subsidy, they have an export subsidy, as well as having an RD on that particular product's import. So the reason we can't have, it's a very long response to a short question, we can't have a charter of economy is because once it starts hurting my brother, your sister, your uncle, my brother, then the discussion drops. That is the reality of it. Asad Umar Saab, when he was Minister for Finance, he tried to have a very active committee on finance in the National Assembly. We have some very good speakers there. You have Nafisa Shah, Hina Rabbani Khar, Naveed Qamar, and this I'm talking about the opposition. You have some very strong people, Aisha Ghaus Pasha, who have tried to revive a charter of economy. But I said the practical problem comes. If you recall last year when we were taking away when we were imposing a 17% sales tax on those 5 sectors of the export-oriented economy that do domestic sales as well, there was a huge pushback that why would you tax somebody who exports? Well, we're not taxing their exports, we're taxing their domestic sales. And if you're going to tax all domestic industry, why do you have a carve-out for these 5? These are your 5 most successful export sectors. You can't be telling me that a sector which is supposed to pay 34 billion is paying 6 billion and we're saying that's fine. No, that's not. That's a 2-year tax and everybody has to pay. So that is, as I said, that is my problem with the private sector. But I understand that, of course, the private sector is not here for charity. They have to do business. And if they've gotten, as I would say, illegal tax breaks in the past, it's time to stop that. We need to streamline. Give your taxes to your SMEs. Give tax breaks to SMEs. Give it to IT sector. Give tax breaks to those companies that in their niche sector, not that have been successful exports for the last 10, 15, 20 years. You have to stop this weaning. You will never become a Turkey or a Chile if you continue to do this. Final point on the issue of dairy sector. You're aware that the Prime Minister had an agriculture emergency program. The Speaker has a specific committee called the Special Committee on Agriculture Products. We talk to the provinces, as you know, the agriculture, food, labor, youth, these are all provincial issues. So we're actively interfering in provincial politics because we found we had all these people come and meet us, youth, women, farmers, that nobody listens to us. There's no committee for farmers, there's no committee for youth, there's no committee for women, and the provinces have not yet gotten their act together in this particular issue, and that includes the provinces where we have a government. So what we've done is we're actively talking to these 3 different sectors, lobbies, whatever you call them, We're coming up with a supplement to the Prime Minister's Agriculture Emergency Program from the Speaker's Committee that's going to go through the MNFSR, the Ministry of National Food Security, and this proposal will be presented to the private sector. It's not going to be a part of the budget because we don't have that kind of money right now. But we're trying to do things out of the box. We're trying to do structural reforms in backward, as you say, backward movement. So we're going to have a reverse engineering sort of model with 7-year plan, 3-year plan, 1-year plan. And in that, we're trying to do things that the budget and the provinces are already doing, but in some sense, we're the big brother watching them, because we've got about 10 industries, the provinces, the private sector, and we need to shake this foundation. So for youth, for dairy, all of this, we're doing that. We've got the private sector on board, we've got investors on board, we've got foreigners on board. So this cannot be, the reason I say this here is because it's not public yet, but we have a lot of public consultation on this. So on the question to this young gentleman who asked, we are doing this to the best of our ability, but it's very hard post 18th Amendment. Thank you.